This is Solum Literary Press. I'm your host, Riley Bounds, and this is the Solum Podcast, where we discuss and examine the intersection of the modern renaissances in evangelical literature, philosophy, and spiritual formation. Today I'm excited to have Dr. Andrew Sorokowski on the podcast. Andrew Sorokowski was born in Connecticut to Ukrainian refugee parents and grew up in San Francisco. He studied Romance and Slavic languages and literatures and holds a PhD in history. He also holds a JD from the University of California. He resides near Washington, D.C. He has published translations of poems by Natalka Belos-Cerkevits in Subprimal Poetry Arts and Peacock Journal. Two of his own poems have appeared in Image, as well as his poem Christmas from Solum Journal, Volume 1. More information will be given in the show notes, including a link to his LinkedIn profile and his contributor profile on the Solum website if you want to find out more. So Andrew, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, just tell us a bit about yourself. Namely, how did you come to Christ?
Well, I think that's, for some people, I guess, it's a one-time event, becoming a Christian. I was brought up in a church, and like many people in childhood, and like many people as a teenager, I began to ask the big questions. Is there someone up there, who created all this and who is in charge of all this? Does God exist? And can we have some kind of relationship with him? Now, again, there wasn't a kind of one-time clarification, but there was a gradual process. And in a way, it's a lifelong process. Obviously, at some point in your life, you make that commitment. But, and that to me actually happened probably fairly late in life, maybe in my 30s, but certainly already in high school, I had a few friends who were, I think, spiritually more advanced than me. And they were reading C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and so on. I mean, this often took a kind of literary form of interest or a point of departure. And then a lot of it was a series of things that I read and also experiences where one does feel the presence of the divine. I remember once at Easter in my freshman year of college. And then I also in college read the Confessions of St. Augustine, which I think had an enormous effect on me. That was a kind of turning point. But as you know, in college, you encounter all sorts of ideas and all sorts of arguments and points of view, and you have these moments of doubt and wavering and these various deviations throughout your 20s perhaps and 30s. But it was always for me a process, in the direction of coming closer to God. And I think I read some authors who had also an effect on me, certainly Tolstoy and then later Dostoevsky. I'd say that it's been an ongoing process. One kind of one is always growing in faith.
Now, you've also been an activist for religious freedom in communist regimes. So why don't you just tell us a bit about that generally?
Well, I was very fortunate in the 1980s to have an opportunity to work at Keston College in England. It has since moved to Oxford, and now actually the archives of Keston College are at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. But that organization was very active. It was founded by an Anglican clergyman, the late Reverend Michael Bordeaux, who died just recently. Remarkable man, by the way, just remarkable individual. And his organization, he actually received the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion at one point. Keston College was a real kind of ecumenical enterprise, which was on the one hand a research institute, which studied religion in communist lands. That was in fact the name of his journal. And so it was an academic enterprise. but it was also an activist enterprise. It did both. And it advocated religious liberty for people living in regimes, political regimes, which had an anti-religious policy. And that meant basically communist regimes. Their emphasis was the Soviet Union because that's where their expertise was. They had specialists on Russia, and I came in as a specialist on Ukraine in 1984. They also dealt with various East European countries, Poland, Hungary, also the Baltic states. And one thing about that was that it was a wonderful opportunity to work with people of different Christian denominations. Tended to be Protestants, evangelicals, Methodists. There were Catholics there. There was at least one Orthodox woman, Russian Orthodox. And all these people of different nationalities, different denominations cooperated in this enterprise. So it was a wonderful experience. And of course, the situations we dealt with were all different and complicated because in the different communist countries, it wasn't simply a matter of there being officially atheist and persecuting Christians, but there were different ways in which they manipulated churches, gave concessions, took away concessions. There were a lot of temptations for Christians, particularly in the Soviet Union. And when I studied Ukraine, for example, one of the big issues then was for the evangelical Christians, Baptists. Should they register and follow the Soviet laws, or should they not register with the government and basically go beyond the law? And the problem was that the law forbade a lot of things like teaching religion. Now, you can imagine that for an evangelical Christian, not being allowed to share your faith with anyone, even with your own children, but certainly with no one beyond your family, was a denial of who you were, what you were, of your beliefs. So many there was a famous group, of course, under Georgy Vince of the evangelical Christian Baptists who would not register with the government. And there were other churches. I dealt with the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which was illegal, had gone underground. It was called the Catacomb Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church didn't even exist. It had been completely eradicated by Stalin, and yet it cropped up then in the late 80s. So there were a lot of interesting things to follow. And of course, we did our best to publicize this.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you tell us a bit about the Catacomb Church that you mentioned?
Well, yes, in Eastern Europe, there are several formerly Orthodox churches which in the 16th or 17th century and later came back into communion with the Roman Catholic Church. And they are like many religious groups in Europe, in Eastern Europe in the 19th century, became connected with national revivals, revivals of national culture. And that made them very suspect in the eyes of the Soviet authorities. And during World War II, Western Ukraine came under Soviet rule. And the Soviets tried to co-opt the church, just that they had tried to they had co-opted the Russian Orthodox Church, first nearly destroying it, and then during World War II, reviving it under condition that it would basically act as an arm of the state. Now, the Ukrainian Catholic Church refused to do that. And it was a suspect, partly because it had foreign connections, partly because it was tied up with the National Revival, which was ideologically a competitor to Soviet rule, to communist rule. And it was simply a church which was not going to play along. So it was it was liquidated, it was driven underground, heavily persecuted. Hundreds of priests and faithful were arrested, sent to exile in Siberia. And none of the bishops would cooperate with the Soviet regime, and most of them died in exile or in prison. So that was an officially non-existent church, but we knew that there were a few million people who were secretly practicing their faith. And that was the issue that I was dealing with. And I was able to go over there in 1990 when it was still the Soviet Union And at a time when Gorbachev had met with the Pope and had agreed to allow this church to register its parishes in compliance with Soviet law. And I saw this, revival of faith, not only among the Ukrainian Catholics, but also among the Ukrainian Orthodox, and of course other denominations, which then were really freely uh, beginning to freely act. But this was, a remarkable situation because it was still the Soviet Union. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and there was this great kind of rebirth of religion.
It's very easy to say, Stalin and the Soviet Union, they're just motivated by evil. But what what were the concrete motivations of the Soviet Union? What was the motivation for the suppression of religion and Christianity, especially?
Well, I think basically, that's a good question because there's more than one motive. But I think basically you just have to read, Karl Marx and then the Marxist view of religion. I mean, Marxism regards religion as a sort of fakery, as something dreamed up by the ruling class to keep the proletariat down, to keep the poor people down. The idea is that because religion promises heaven, it distracts people from striving for improving their earthly lot. And this is, of course, untrue. And Marx is, it's kind of surprising. Marx was a very intelligent person, but he had this very primitive view of what religion did. And he regarded it simply as a tool of class oppression. And so I think, that's the first thing. I mean, anyone who's a Marxist, whether socialist or communist, any of those regimes is going to see religion as socially destructive, as an impediment to their program of motivating the proletariat to revolt again and overthrow the system, and as a kind of obstacle to their program of creating what they regarded as a perfect society. Now, I think that it also goes deeper than this because some people have pointed out that Marxism, especially in the Leninist variety, became a kind of substitute religion, something that atheists could believe in. And so it sees religion as a competitor. And that's another reason why I think it is so virulently anti-religious, because it tries to be a kind of belief system of its own, which has which is absolutist, which explains everything. So you can't have a rival. And then the other thing is, of course, that Marxists regard churches as an impediment because first they see churches as pillars of the bourgeois or capitalist structure. Again, untrue, that's an oversimplification. But they also see churches simply as one more institution that they can't control. Again, in Russia, they succeeded in getting the Russian Orthodox Church to allow itself to be controlled by an atheist regime. But I mean, it was either that or perish. They almost destroyed it. So it's not surprising. But by and large, for these reasons, Marxist regimes, communist regimes, see both religion and religious organizations as an obstacle to be removed, and as something which just cuts against their program and their worldview.
So, do you have any insights as to why communist states trust the supremacy of the states so deeply?
I think that is the only way that they can put through their program. I mean, they claim that they are for socialism and equality of socioeconomic equality of all people, and yet you can't make that happen unless you pit one class against another and then establish a strong government to enforce that. So the irony is that in enforcing equality, you have to destroy equality. You have to have this kind of superclass of bureaucrats and rulers who force the rest of society to be equal. So what you get is very much what you in fact did get, and I saw this in the Soviet Union and to some extent in a country like Poland, where you have the mass of the population living in something close to poverty, And then you have this class of, but they're all equal, all these poor people. And then you have this wealthy class of bureaucrats and political bosses who make sure that everyone else is living in conditions of equal poverty. So it's a self-defeating proposition, really.
Mm,
But that's one of the many contradictions of communism, so to speak.
right.
Uh,
So the Soviet Union surely has had looked on other prior forms of communist government and taken inspiration, probably. But what do you think made them think that they could do it correctly?
well, that's a very good question, because Marx himself didn't think that the revolution should occur in Russia, because Russia was so backwards. He thought it should occur in Germany, where you had the most advanced. It was the most advanced country in the 19th century in Europe, and had the most advanced and politically conscious proletariat. And yet in Germany, what happened was the social democracy and the trade unions took the fore, and Marxism sort of fell out of fashion. And other countries like France and England were able to enact a lot of social reform without turning to socialism. So as it happened, the Russian revolutionaries who adapted Marxism decided they would revise it a little bit and say, despite what Marx or Engels thought, actually Russia is going to jump ahead, and it's going to jump across those necessary stages of developing a middle class and a bourgeoisie and a bureaucracy, and a middle class democracy. It's going to jump ahead, and it's going to make the revolution happen. I mean, I think this is, it's kind of a mystery, but I think it's to some extent tied up with Russian messianism, with the idea that Russia will save the world. To some extent, it was tied up with Russian autocracy, because autocracy made it possible for the government to make all sorts of experiments upon the people, so that even though they overthrew the Tsarist government, you could still have the same bureaucrats and the same military people imposing more, another crazy ideology upon the mass of the peasantry, who really had no choice and had no way of resisting. So perhaps that's why they thought they could do it there. But it was grossly misconceived, and if you look at the results, it's really frightening.
Yes. Yeah. Um, so you lived in the USSR at one point, correct?
Well, I spent, I guess, several weeks there. Maybe a couple of months in total, and I spent 3 months in Poland also, when
Mhm.
it was still communist Poland.
Right. So why don't you just tell us just a bit about what it was like? What did you
Yeah.
see? What did you experience there?
Well, maybe the most striking thing that I recall from those visits was to see how the catacomb church lived, because at that time, even though there had already been a kind of a détente with the West, and reforms and human rights reforms, political prisoners were being released. Although, just a few years before, there had been people dying in the prison camps. But you had, and then you had the church. The church was emerging. But I saw where, for example, the Greek Catholic Archbishop of the city of Lviv in Western Ukraine, I saw how he lived, and he had to have, some of his faithful taking turns watching his apartment to warn him in case anyone came to arrest him, or to keep out provocateurs, people who might, create a situation which would create a pretext for arresting him. He lived in a one room, didn't have his own kitchen or bathroom. Like many people in the Soviet Union, all he had was a room for himself. There were, in many cases, people with families also lived in one room, and they shared both the bathroom and the kitchen with their neighbors, whoever those neighbors might be. And that's how he lived. And it was incredible. I mean, there were several of us just crammed into this little room. So that was really a striking view of how the underground church lived, and how a person who, in the eyes of the government, was just another ordinary citizen, lived. But I saw also, some of the effects of the policies of the government. Of course, again, the poverty, the crowded conditions in which people lived. You also saw the kind of moral deterioration that had occurred in the late Soviet period. A lot of alcoholism, kind of people living really without any kind of hope or optimism, very deep cynicism, corruption, theft, just little details like the condition of the buildings. Everything was falling apart. People didn't care about the property because it wasn't theirs. The buildings were falling apart. Things were shoddily made. People did not take pride in their work because it was not theirs. And in fact, people would often say, they would steal from, public property because there was no private property, practically none. And they'd say, well, this belongs to everyone. It's nationalized. It belongs to the people. So why can't I help myself to it, right? I mean, it's logical in a sense. If there's no private property, how can you feel guilty about theft? So it was, you saw that demoralization. You saw former churches turned into movie theaters, clubhouses, that kind of thing. The ruins of monasteries, kind of depressing and kind of gray. And I was actually in the most westernized part of the Soviet Union, Western Ukraine. When I went to Kiev, which was more maybe in the Soviet mainstream, I saw even more of that, kind of depressing atmosphere, very, very, very gray, as it often is depicted in films. And but also that kind of demoralization. And yet you met people who somehow had gotten through it all and who were of course, I met people who were anti-Soviet. So of course, I met people who had resisted all those processes and somehow managed to keep their sanity and their good sense, and who had grown up in that system and from their very first conscious day of life, had seen that it was wrong and opposed it. And of course, a lot of those people got into some very serious political trouble. And if they were either imprisoned, sent to prison camps, or they were just persecuted, had to report to their local friendly KGB agent and just tell them what they were up to. Living in, it's a lot of stress when you're in that position of being constantly suspect and you can't get a job anymore and so on. So I met people like that. And in meeting people, you got a good insight into what that system had done to people.
Right. So why don't you say a bit more about the persecution of Christians there?
And again, when we think of persecution, I think we think of, sort of overt things like a person being arrested and sent to prison. And certainly that was, the case with a lot of religious leaders in particular. And again, I'd met people who had been in prison for that reason. But there were more subtle forms of persecution. Again, there were simply the fact that if you, for example, if you talked about religion with your children, in a place like Kiev, my wife spent her childhood there, and she said, her parents were afraid to even talk about religion with her, or even talk about something like Christmas, because the neighbors might hear, and the neighbors might report it to someone. And very often people, tattling on their friends and neighbors. And there was an incredible amount of that, informant activities, because you would be rewarded for that, and you would yourself then stay out of trouble if you informed on someone else. And if you informed on people, well, if they were children, their chances of getting into the university could be compromised, could end completely. If somebody who was an adult was informed on for holding the wrong ideas, that person could lose, his or her job. And if you lost your job, you lost your food. You lost a lot of things. You were really in bad shape. You couldn't just go and get another job. You would be blacklisted. Those people, again, would be discriminated against their whole lives. And they used to say, how come? Oh, they used to say, well, look at the churches in the Soviet Union. They're full, and they're full of old people because only the old people are religious, and they're going to die soon, so that's why they care about religion. Well, that's not quite true. And why is it that it's only the old women? Well, it was old women because men didn't live very long in that system. The healthcare was terrible. The conditions of life, the pollution, the alcoholism, all these things made for a very short lifespan for men, a short one for women, but women lived a bit longer. Why were the churches full of old people? Because old people had nothing more to lose. They had their pensions. The government would not cut off people's pensions. I mean, that would have been really perceived as too cruel. So once you were retired, you really had nothing to be afraid of. Your career was over. You were done with. So you could then practice religion freely. For a young person to practice religion, you would get no education. Your children might not get an education. You would, again, you had no career, your career was over. So that was the more subtle kind of persecution, which put a real chilling effect on any kind of religious activity or even talking about it. In the villages, you could get away with more because the villages, the police couldn't watch everyone, and people really didn't care that much. I mean, the government cared less about what happened in the countryside because they saw the countryside as backwards, the village as something which was going to die out anyway, and religion along with it. But in the cities, it was a very risky business.
So is there a way that we can help these persecuted Christians in communist countries?
Yeah. Well, of course, now we're talking about places like China, Cuba, North Korea. Not that the Soviet Union is gone, but I think the same issues come up. In those days, when I was active in these matters, there was a book, I think it was by Trevor Beeson, called Discretion and Valor. And it was based on that British saying that valor is the better part, or the discretion is the better part of valor. And what that means is that, yes, it's good to be brave and daring, but it's more important to be careful. And what that meant in the context of religious freedom was that you sometimes had to be diplomatic. You had to work through diplomatic channels because you couldn't get anything done otherwise. At the same time, you had to tell the truth. So you had to do both. And of course, there were people who were good at making a lot, calling attention to the problem of religious persecution. And there were other people who preferred to work behind the scenes, and maybe they tended not to rock the boat, but they wanted to enter into dialogue with the authorities. And actually, you need to do both. And I think that may depend in part on your temperament, but I think, need to both work on the government level, for example, and talk with these governments, negotiate with them, exert pressure. And at the same time, we need to have people who are, shouting and screaming and saying, look at these horrible things which are happening. And these two approaches work together. Now, the U.S., has a commission on international religious freedom. So that certainly has a political role to play, a diplomatic role. There are private organizations. Various churches have their private organizations which study the church in the different countries where the churches are persecuted. So I think people can work through those organizations. And I think, again, one needs to tell the truth about the persecution, which is, enormous these days, and it comes from different quarters. It's not only in those totalitarian countries, but it's in relatively democratic countries also, where there's simply a majority population which is intolerant of Christians. Where those places are, and there are countries where the governments are, for example, confessional governments which persecute Christianity. So there again, you've got to work on both fronts, tell the truth, but also pull those levers.
Now, are there any websites to these different commissions, different international commissions to?
The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom does have a website. I think you just key in that name, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and
okay. So, on the more philosophical end of this, do you
Mm,
think that communism is inherently evil, or do
uh,
you think that evil people have appropriated it for evil ends?
well, I'd say, first off, I'd say both. I mean, both are true. I think that there is a tendency for people sometimes to say, well, communism was a noble idea. It was very idealistic, and it's just, it was abused. Lenin was okay. Stalin kind of perverted it and turned it into something evil. I mean, I think that's wrong. I think Lenin was wrong from the very beginning. One of the first things he did was to found the Cheka, the secret police. Then there are people who say that communism was okay. It's just that it was used by power hungry people. And again, yes, it was used by power hungry people, but I think that's almost beside the point. I think that it is an inherently, you know, I'm, it's an inherently mistaken and indeed evil ideology, because I think it uh, well, first of all, it's atheist, and I think that's, for Christians, I think that's the first objection you have to make. This is an ideology which denies the existence of God. So that should kind of make you wonder. It also has a false understanding of human nature, and in two ways. I mean, first of all, well, or maybe second of all, it treats people as simply economic creatures that are only interested in material goods.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it doesn't account for the fact that people do, however, want to better their state, that people want to work hard and enjoy the fruits of their labor. Um, and just it doesn't account for the fact that people need some kind of incentive to work. They're only going to work if they can get something for their work, if they get some kind of reward. It doesn't mean they all have to get rich, but people do want to better their lot. That's simply natural. So it misunderstands human nature in that sense. It also, of course, misunderstands human nature in that it treats human beings as purely economic creatures, and they're not. It denies the spiritual, it denies the soul, it denies the aesthetic and cultural. I mean, think about you know communist culture. What is it? I've asked myself, where is it? They were incapable of creating a culture. In the 20s, they did have an interesting culture, but they were still not fully, they were still on their way to full communism then. And there was this great explosion of experimental art and music and so on. It was wonderful. But once they really became a communist country under Stalin, it was completely sterile. And it was sterile because it treats human beings as cogs in a machine. So I think it's evil, but it's evil because it is so utterly untrue. you know. Um, and of course, you see the consequences though. When you misunderstand what human beings are, you treat them. If you believe that they are like cattle, then you treat them. I mean, no offense to cattle, by the way, they're God's creatures. But if you treat people like cattle, you turn them into cattle. You destroy their minds, their souls. And this is why you have so much social malaise in Russia now. These are still the after effects of communism. You have alcoholism, people living in despair and darkness, believing in nothing. I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
a very, very dark and gloomy kind of result. Not to mention, of course, the killing of millions of people, which again, communism justifies that, because having removed God, having removed religion, Dostoevsky saw this coming, by the way, in the novel The Possessed. I mean, it's a great novel. People should read that. He saw, in the 1870s, he saw what was coming. And he's, the famous statement, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. Now, the thing with ideologies like communism and Nazism, by the way, same thing, is by removing God as a source of justice and of removing the idea of morality. And Nietzsche, by the way, who's now very popular again among young people for some reason, Nietzsche was the one who said, Christian morality is a sham and so on. And, we have to go beyond ethics and morality. That's something for weak people. So this cult of strength and the idea that you can do whatever you want and you'll get away with it because there is no God who will judge you. There is no right or wrong. There is no ethics or morality. when you have an ideology like that, people permit themselves the most incredible things. They will destroy millions of their fellow human beings, and they think it's justified because it's, for the revolution, or someday it'll, the end will justify the means. Another anti-Christian concept, which some people seem to subscribe to. So communism, like fascism, is evil in the sense that, yes, it breaks down all sense of ethics, morality, and the responsibility of people to God, the responsibility to each other. And it makes possible the most incredible atrocities, tens of millions of people destroyed, just like that. And, people, even Western intellectuals, and especially Western intellectuals in the 30s, would say things like, the Soviet Union is a noble experiment. And yes, millions of people have to die, but, it's all for the greater good. And it'll all be justified in the end. It's chilling that they could say such a thing.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but,
It completely eschews the inherent worth of human beings
yeah,
for a
yeah,
consequentialist ethic, which I
yeah,
think there are deep problems with. Um,
yeah.
Now, would you say that America is moving in the direction of socialism or communism?
It's an interesting question. I mean, not communism, I don't think, and admiration and faith in the American people to think that there's, would do that. I mean, we're just, for one thing, we're just too ornery to submit to that kind of system. At least I hope that's true. Too democratic. And, we are a deeply democratic people. I mean, that is a political tradition of freedom, which I think protects us from some of that foolishness. But I think there are dangers because with what appears to be a decline in religion, you do have the rise of kind of a materialist ethic. And materialism is, of course, is the necessary groundwork for, for socialism and communism. And again, this is the problem with socialism in particular, is that most, there is such a thing as Christian socialism, that historically, it didn't really have much success.
Yeah.
But the problem with socialism is it is inherently atheist, it's materialist. And again, that's a misunderstanding of humanity and life. And I think that is its great flaw. Now, that doesn't mean that, capitalism is always good and has no flaws. In fact, I think one of the things that drives some people towards socialism is their sense of justice. Especially young people. Young people are always idealistic and always trying to improve things, and they believe they can change the world for the better. Every generation does this. Mine did too, of course. But I think that's the attraction of socialism. It seems to promise justice and equality, and it seems to promise that it will correct the injustices that we have, in under capitalism. But I think the problem is, again, that it is a godless ideology. Now, there can be such a thing as godless capitalism too. I mean, there are those who who believe that, who are materialists and who believe that the free market is the most, the highest principle, because that's all that matters, is that people can buy stuff, and that of course is absolutely anti-Christian too. But I think the problem with socialism, the insidious thing, is that it does appear to promise equality, although, as I said earlier, you can't enforce equality without destroying equality. So it's self-contradictory. The other thing is that there is a human right to property. I don't mean vast amounts of capital or land, but to the kind of property that a person needs to survive, to sustain a family. That is a basic human right. There's a human right to the fruits of one's labor. So why should a person who works more be forced to share equally with someone who doesn't want to work? I mean, that's unjust. But that's what happened with, certainly in the communist system, with the collective farms and collective enterprises. People who were some people worked, some didn't, and it was very demoralizing for the people who wanted to do honest, creative work. So if there is, I mean, if there are people, certainly in the U.S., who are tending towards socialism, not merely social justice. I think social justice is perfectly fine, but if they really think that socialism is the answer, they should just study it a little more and study history. And I think a reasonable person would understand why that is just not going to work. You know, read Marx, read Engels, read Lenin, study what happened in these various countries, and
Hmm.
any reasonable person will conclude that this is not the answer. You know, I think that there is a kind of Christian democracy which could work and which could give people um, more social justice, but freedom at the same time, and which emphasizes maybe the right of the family or the individual to have enterprises, which encourages cooperative enterprises, and which would thus, avoid some of the injustices of globalist capitalism, but which also would avoid the, really destructive consequences of socialism.
Hmm. Well, that was great. Thank you. So let's move a little bit now into your more personal endeavors.
Okay.
Um, so you've worn a lot of hats.
Yeah.
You've been a poet. You've been a forensic historian, a lawyer, and a translator, and that makes me feel very insecure. Um,
No
but
need. You're a
uh,
lot younger.
yeah, still working on it. How have you been able to get into and work in so many fields?
Well, I think that is to some extent just the consequence of maybe not doing too well in some of them. I don't know. The way things turn out, I mean, is often surprising. But don't be too impressed, because I mean, I think I've had my failures too, and I guess we in America have a kind of ethos of success, and we all want to be above average, and we all want to be great and famous and rich and so on. And so we find it hard to accept the fact that we often fail, and that
Yeah.
we are a flawed species, and we don't always know where we're going. Some people seem to know what they're doing very well, and they have meteoric careers, but most of us, try one thing, we try another. I take some solace in looking at the careers of some writers. People, it's been said that Mark Twain, for example, failed at a whole series of things before he became a writer. Um, so I wouldn't make too much of that. I've had an interesting time. I've done different things, but they didn't always lead to something. I mean, I wanted to be a tenured professor. I was very fortunate to teach for a while, but I couldn't get a permanent full-time job. So yeah, that's as much a result of failure as a success. But you kind of have to have some faith that you're being led in some good direction. I think I started out wanting to be a writer when I was a child, and I sort of ended up being a writer, and so it all sort of turned out well in the end.
Hmm. Hmm. So, what languages do you speak and translate?
Well, yeah, it depends on how one would define knowing a language. I guess I know two languages well, English and Ukrainian. Ukrainian I actually spoke at home before I learned English, but I learned English very quickly, and I made a point of learning it quickly because I was teased at school for not being able to pronounce certain words. So I'd say two that I really know well, and I have translated, Ukrainian to English, not English to Ukrainian. I would not try that.
Hmm.
But then there are, maybe six or seven that I know badly. I know a lot of languages badly. And I mean, that is to say, I can read them with a dictionary. I can actually, translate maybe from some of them with a dictionary and with some help. But I speaks a few of them badly, and I don't write well in any of them. Basically, two groups, Romance languages. I mean, Latin I had in school, and then French, Spanish, Italian I can get by in. And then, the Slavic languages are very close to each other. So I studied Russian and Polish, and yeah, I can sort of get by. I can't say I know them well, but
Hmm.
I can do a pretty impressive job of speaking them badly.
How did you find your way into poetry?
I remember that, about the fifth or sixth grade, for some reason, I was reading the Iliad in one of those old Victorian translations. I guess it must have been assigned or suggested to me. And I got the idea that, I would write an epic poem. And I just remember, sitting in study hall, and on some scratch paper, I started writing this verse after verse, this epic poem. And I don't remember how far I got, but I mean, that was my first kind of impulse. And I don't really know why I did it. I just wanted to do it. I
Mm.
didn't really think about it. And then later on, I had some good English teachers. I remember in eighth grade, we read some of T.S. Eliot, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, a poem that
Mhm.
has been in my head ever since, become sort of emblematic for me. And at that time, people memorized poems. I don't know if they do it now, but we were required to memorize, a poem or two, and that is a very good way of getting to appreciate poetry because you're forced to think about it. Once you've memorized it, it's in your head, and you're sort of turning it around, and you're beginning to see more deeply into it.
Mhm.
Um, and that sort of got me interested in it. And then, like many people, as a teenager, young person, I wrote some poems. And then, but then I sort of took a break for about 50 years, and then, but I think I really then got back into it because I met, I met Natalka Bielotserkiewicz, whose husband actually was on some sort of Fulbright um, scholarship here in the US, and got talking about translations of poetry. And I got the idea into my head of translating some of her poetry, although it was quite challenging. And I found that I really enjoyed that process. It was very difficult, but it was also a lot of fun, extremely gratifying.
Mhm.
And then from translating, I sort of got back into writing it because, it was a very easy sort of transition, a natural transition. So, but that was already in a rather advanced stage, but
Mhm.
I was taking up a lot of the themes I had written about
Right.
when I was younger.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in the meantime, of course, I'd always been interested always read it with pleasure. It's just that the actual writing
Mhm.
I'd put on pause.
Mhm. Yeah. So most of the poems that you've written are sonnets, including the ones
Yeah,
that you'll read for us at the end of this. So why do you tend to gravitate toward the formal verse?
I think that's partly a matter of temperament, just one's own mentality. I tend to seek order. I have, maybe because there's something in my background of displacement and, what my family went through in the war and afterwards. It breeds a certain insecurity, and one seeks, order and logic. And the sonnet is a very orderly form, very intellectual form, and that again maybe is just my own inclination to kind of intellectualize things, but it has a kind of dialectical form, A, B, and therefore C, and then, that kind of thing. Um, so it's a matter of temperament, but and I tend to like form um, because it's simply easier to kind of formulate my thoughts when I have a structure. Some people aren't like that at all. They find form constricting. I find form, in a way liberating because once you've got the form, and to kind of give you a structure, you can be more creative in what you put into that structure, and you don't have to worry about whether it's going to be formless or not. Again, that's a kind of anxiety maybe of the displaced person. Um,
Mhm.
but on the other hand, I also like haiku is, for example, kind of an interesting form for me also.
Mhm.
And I think the thing about that is that it is in a way comes close to a perfect a perfect form because you have those two lines and then you have this kind of surprising turn at the third line. But the interesting thing about actually back to the sonnet is that it is a kind of perfect form. It's been shown mathematically that the proportions of a sonnet are like the golden mean. And if you look at the golden mean as a mathematical concept, it coincides with the form of the sonnet if you assume that the ninth line is where there's a kind of the volta, the turn. So it's a kind of eternal form. I mean, it's remarkably it's something you see in nature, in architecture, in mathematics, all over the place. The sonnet is really a remarkable form, and that's one of the reasons I like it. I have tried to write free verse or looser forms, and sometimes you do that, but I don't start out with the form. I start out with the idea, and then the idea finds its own shape. It tells me what form it wants to take, and usually it wants to be a sonnet.
Mhm. What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of free verse and formal verse over one another?
So yeah, well, I think the creativity, I guess, takes place in a different way and in a different form. I mean, once you've got the form as a structure, you can be creative with what you put into that form. You don't have to worry, you basically are constricted already, so you have to make the most of that structure. Um, but you've got to have rhymes, or you've got to have rhythms and so on. And that, in a sense, limits your choices. With free verse or something like that, there are no limits. So you're kind of, in a way, it's more difficult in that sense. It's easier with regard to form, and yet it's more difficult because those words have to be exactly the right words. You have no excuse to choose, a rhyming word as opposed to a non-rhyming word. You really, really have to have the right word there. And that, I think, that just puts the pressure on content and on choice of words. Um, and it has to. I mean, then perhaps you want it to approximate speech. Perhaps you want it to approximate music or sound. The creativity shifts to maybe different places, different aspects of the poem. Sonnet is a little bit like solving a problem. It's kind of something slightly mechanical about it. When you have free verse, when you don't have those constrictions, there's a greater burden to choose absolutely the best word at every point. You have no excuse to choose a rhyming word over a non-rhyming word. You've got to choose the best word, and that's an enormous burden.
Mhm.
It's very
Mhm.
hard.
Now, I think that, well, it's very rare that I get a sonnet crossing my desk as an editor.
Mhm.
Uh, and to that end, formal verse at all. It's pretty well. Well, it's not gone, but it's I guess you could say it's going extinct, or maybe it has been going extinct for a long time. It's even rarer that I get a good sonnet. Um, so I was going to ask, do you think that we should be writing more sonnets, or do you think that we should be working on like building up our own artistic uh, intellect to match like what the sonnet demands of a poet?
Well, I think that again, the form is not the first consideration. I think the form follows from what you're going to say and how you are able to say it. So I wouldn't start out saying, programmatically we're going to do sonnets, or we're going to do, this type of verse, or some other form. I think the poet has to start with the idea, the concept, and the concept finds its own form. So I wouldn't be too programmatic. What I would not do is I would not eliminate, I would not turn down sonnets because they're sonnets, or some other form because it's not a popular form. I think people have to write, you write a poem, it finds its own form. And some poets find their form in the sonnet, some in something more complicated, more difficult, something, some in couplets and some in free verse. And I think you just have to be open to all of them. Um, but I think again the form is the medium. It's not the message, as it were, and that it has to follow naturally. I do think there is, of course, there are certain dangers. On the one hand, too much formalism can get very artificial. So there are poets who, yeah, they write sonnets, or they write very regular rhyming verse, but it's kind of uninteresting because they're sacrificing content to form, and it's just too artificial. And then you have the other extreme of poetry, which is so free and easy that it's just not interesting to read. It's, it in prose. It's like sloppy prose. So that's the other extreme. I would try to stick with the interplay between the form and the function. Preserve some forms, but be open to all forms. But I think there's always some kind of form, and it may just be something in the rhythm of, but that's still a kind of form. Rhythm is form too, in a sense. So yeah.
Um, do you use your poetry to explore your faith?
Uh, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think there's a connection. I'm not sure that that is the connection, but I think that it naturally takes poetic form. Um, I have quite a few poems on what you would call religious themes and philosophical themes. It's a way of working out problems. I mean, again, if you look at the sonnet, there's a kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis sometimes. You pose a problem, you may pose the possible answer, then a kind of or a kind of objection to it, and then a resolution. I mean, these could be philosophical, religious, theoretical problems. Well, not theoretical. I mean, they're very real life problems. But certainly, the sonnet provides a kind of form for posing a question, an objection, and then maybe some kind of synthetic answer. So I think the sonnet lends itself very well to that kind of religious or philosophical contemplation and some kind of conclusion. Um, so, absolutely. There are other, probably other forms of poetry which lend themselves to other types of, religious contemplation, maybe more intuitive. But certainly I find the sonnet lends itself very well to that kind of thinking. Yeah. And that kind of expression. Yeah.
So I ask all my poets this on the podcast: why should lay people care about poetry? What effect does
Yeah.
it have on our daily lives?
Well, I think first of all, when I should go back when I was in college. I studied with a professor named Elroy Bundy, and he was kind of an unusual person. This was at Berkeley, of all places, and we studied some of the criticism and poetry of Ivor Winters and Kenneth Fields and a few people in that school, which is rather out of fashion now. But they felt that poetry has to deal with reality. In fact, they came out with an anthology of poems which had almost no romantic poems in it, because they felt, expressing your feelings, that's not great poetry. I mean, there were a few exceptions, but basically they eliminated the 19th century and part of the 20th. They went back to the metaphysical poets of the 17th, 16th, and 17th century. They looked at poets who were seeking truth. And so I think that poetry is a way of seeking and contemplating, the truth, not just expressing your feelings, and this is why these people, avoided romantic poetry, because, who cares about your feelings? I mean, I see a lot of poetry today, which is very expressive. I feel this, I feel that, I'm sad, who cares? It's only interesting if it's something universal. And poetry ought to express some kind of reality. This is what, Winters and Fields and all these other people, they had, in fact, an anthology, I think, called Quest for Reality. But this could be a metaphysical reality. And I think that good religious poetry is realistic in the sense that it doesn't deal with just dreams, or feelings. It deals with spiritual realities, with moral and ethical realities. And love is a reality. If that's the highest Christian virtue, then it is a reality, and it is one which poetry can express. But it's not, just touchy-feely love, but something a little more substantial. So that I think that certainly, I don't know whether this answers your question, but certainly for Christians, I think poetry is very much a way of exploring spiritual realities, of affirming them, of reinforcing them. It's a kind of guide to life in many ways. I think poetry is it I think makes you more contemplative. It's a way of kind of helping you to focus on spiritual realities. But again, not in the sense of something just airy and insubstantial, but of something really concrete and important. So yeah, truth, reality, love. These are all the themes of good poetry.
Right. I mean, there's even biblical precedent for that, isn't there, in the Psalms
Absolutely.
and in the
Yeah.
wisdom literature? Hmm.
Absolutely. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So, as a final note on your poetry career, you've also translated poetry,
Yeah.
and it was in Ukrainian, right?
Yeah. It was. Yeah. I was translating Ukrainian poetry into
Okay.
English. Right. Right.
So, are there many Ukrainian poets out there?
There are many Ukrainian poets. How many really good ones there are, I don't know. The one that you mentioned, Natalka Bilotsirkevich, is a friend of ours. Um, and actually, I have to say that I started on this conversations with her. Again, she and her husband were here in the Washington D.C. area on some sort of fellowship, and I knew about her poetry. I had read some of it before, and she's a well-known poet of the 19th, still in the Soviet period. She was a well-known poet, 70s and 80s, and later. Um, and we got to talking, and we were talking about translations, and she said, "Well, maybe you'd like to try translating some of mine." And I just jumped for the opportunity because I thought that would be interesting. And so I did some of her poetry, and some of that is going to be published. I also uh, have translated some of the Ukrainian poets of the 1920s. That was a generation of poets which, almost all of them were executed in the 30s. I mean, they're called the executed generation, the executed Renaissance, because there was this great flourishing of poetry in the 20s, and then almost all of them were destroyed in the 30s. There were about 3 really good poets who survived by writing very adulatory verse about Stalin. They were still good poets, and they still produced good stuff, but there were only a few who survived. In any case, I translated 2 of those poets, Maxim Rylsky and Mykola Zerov. Rylsky was the one who survived. Zerov was executed in 1938. Those poems were very, it's difficult work, but it's extremely gratifying work. You can't, preserve the sound of the poetry, and unfortunately, that's a big part of it. Especially, I don't know, it seems in Slavic languages, the sound is very rich, and you just can't render that in English. But you can try to throw in a rhyme here and there. You can try to replicate the rhythm, or maybe pick an analogous rhyme scheme. But these poems, both of Natalka Bilotsirkevich and of Zerov and Rylsky, who were neoclassical poets, it's very regular poetry. It's very formalistic, rhyme and rhythm, regular meter. So it's difficult to translate. But it's extremely gratifying to do that. And I spent a long time translating some of these poems. And, as you know, I got some of that published. There's a lot more there's some more that I would like to, I'm still trying to get published. And that, it's a very good exercise of your inventiveness and your creativity. As you know, you're basically writing a new poem. And you're writing it in a new language with different sonorities, with a different flavor. You're trying to create something analogous to the original. And you're also have the challenge of cultural references. A lot of this Ukrainian poetry has all these cultural references, which, the English language reader is just not going to get, is not likely to know. And you can't just have a poem with a lot of footnotes saying, oh, this means that, and this is that, and this refers to that. I mean, you can do some of that, but, it only goes so far. So you have to think of something analogous. And, well, it's a great creative challenge, a wonderful exercise for the mind. And I spent a long time, and in the case of Natalka Bilotsirkevich, going back and forth with her, discussing, line by line, word after word sometimes, how do we translate this and how do we find an English equivalent? And what does this mean to you? And what does this mean to the American reader, American as opposed to, let's say, English or, very difficult and very gratifying and very creative work. And I just loved doing that. And that's actually what brought me back to beginning to write some of my own poetry again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
Well, offhand, can you recommend any other Ukrainian poets?
I mean, I think the most famous Ukrainian poet is Taras Shevchenko, who was a 19th century poet. He's kind of the national poet. And the thing about Shevchenko is that, well, first of all, he's been translated quite well by a whole range of people. Vera Rich, whom I actually met in England, Vera Rich translated his poetry into the more or less the kind of Victorian English of his time, which I didn't like at first because it was, well, very Victorian, but it's actually a very smart thing to do because that was the time in which he lived, and because he preserved a lot of his rhythm and rhyme. There's a more recent translator, Peter Fedinsky, who's translated Shevchenko's most famous work, and Fedinsky translates it into a more, I know the guy, he's a contemporary American English idiom. But this was a very Christian poet. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about Shevchenko. He is known as the national poet. He pretty much sparked the national revival of Ukraine in the 19th century. He wrote about, many things. He was born a serf. His friends had to buy him from his master. I mean, he had a terrible life. He didn't live long. He was, imprisoned. He had all sorts of, bad experiences. But he was a very deeply Christian poet, which means not only that he used Christian imagery, which, atheists can do that, anyone can do that, but he really thought as an Orthodox Christian. And his, of course, his themes were really the hard life of the peasants, the oppression of the people. I mean, it sounds kind of trite today, but at that time, this was, he was very much a social poet, but also a national poet of the Ukrainian people. And it's a beautiful poem. He also wrote a lot of, paraphrases of the Psalms, for example. He had a poem about the neophytes. So he was a Christian poet also in the sense that he was himself a deeply religious man, an Orthodox Christian. And I think that he wasn't simply using Christian imagery. I mean, to him, the social justice and Christianity were all of a piece. This was a time of serfdom. People were bought and sold like chattels, like slavery in the U.S. He died in 1861, the year that serfdom was abolished in Russia. Mm-hmm. But I would recommend, reading Shevchenko, absolutely. Now, of modern poets, oddly enough, I can't think of a lot of Christian poets, and I think maybe because Ukrainian literature has been kind of preoccupied with simply cultural survival, linguistic survival of the people, survival of the culture. But there have been some. Ihor Kalinech, who's still alive, he was a sort of Soviet dissident poet, Kalinech, Kalynets. Certainly a Christian poet in the sense of being a practicing, I think a practicing Catholic actually, but there is, he has poetry with a lot of Christian imagery, and I think he was, there's a Christian worldview here. A contemporary poet who is an acquaintance of mine, Vasyl Makhno, who now lives in New York, I didn't think of him as a sort of Christian poet, but he came out with something called Jerusalem Poems, very nice book in 2 languages. You can get it. It was published a few years ago. And of course, it's, he takes a trip to Jerusalem, and he is this is sort of the encounter of a Christian with Judaism and with the Holy Land. And there's some interesting poems there, which, about Jerusalem in a sort of Judeo-Christian key. And I think that's kind of very interesting. I think it may be very interesting, particularly for people in those Christian traditions which look to the Old Testament very intensely. So Vasyl Makhno, Makhno, contemporary poet, very well translated. This is a bilingual edition by a man named Popovich, who's actually, I think, a chemist, and he's a very good translator. So yeah, there are a few like that, but not as many as one would hope, and maybe that's yet to come.
Well, in closing, Andrew, what would you say are some of the difficulties of being a Christian in American academia and government today?
Well, I think there's more difficulty in academia than in government. Actually, in government, I was very pleased to find fellow believers and that among my co-workers, although they tended to be among the support staff rather than the professional staff. But maybe I was mistaken about that. I was support staff myself, so maybe that's why. But I think that in government, I saw no problems. In fact, surprising what how many sort of people you will find in government that are pretty much on the same wavelength. Um, Now, and I was working in the Department of Justice. I was working in people sort of in the legal field. Um, I think that in academia, well, we know what the problems are. Very few academics are religiously inclined, shall we say. Um, but there are some very notable exceptions here and there. But yeah, my experience. I mean, I didn't have any difficulty because of that. But I think that people maybe sometimes looked askance at me. They wanted to make sure I was not some kind of fanatic, because this is, people and intellectuals, when they encounter a person who is religious, they immediately think fanatic, or or else some extremely uneducated redneck type of person, and unfortunately that stereotype still persists, and you kind of have to stake out your territory there and say, look, I'm a sane person.
Mm.
But one feels kind of lonely in the academic world, yeah, because the cynics and the doubters and the unbelievers are certainly seem to be in the majority. I know, although I knew some people in the academic world who were very religiously committed people. They usually didn't make brilliant careers, but they were there, and but most people are kind of open-minded to it.
Mm.
So I don't think I suffered discrimination, but I think there's a kind of natural selectivity. I mean, I think people tend to favor people who think like they do, and since the kind of secular humanist mindset has come to prevail in the academic world, there's a kind of selection there of you know like-minded people, and but for the same reason, I'm very pleased when I come across people who are really open to religious perspectives. Um, I wish there were more such people in the academic world, but I think another problem is that, of course, a lot of the approaches we see in intellectual life, in the humanities in particular, are connected with ideologies, like Marxism, for example, in whatever form, which are, of course, essentially anti-religious um,
Mm.
philosophies. And it's kind of difficult to make your way. I mean, I sometimes think, I wanted to be a literary scholar at one point, and I almost did a PhD in comparative literature. When I now look back and I see the direction that field took, uh, shortly after I would have had done my PhD, I think I would probably have been out of a job very quickly, because there were some very crazy ideologies, very nihilistic kind of approaches, ideologies which were basically Marxist or very similar to that. And I just would not have felt comfortable
Mm.
with that kind of approach. Simply because these were not approaches which I would have found interesting or fruitful,
Mhm.
given my philosophical kind of worldview, as it were.
Right.
So that's the problem that one gets. In the professional world and in the world of lawyers, I didn't have any trouble at all. I mean, on that count, I think you will find some very very pious people among
Yeah.
practicing
Yeah.
lawyers. It's like any profession.
But it seems like the central problem then is in academia.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
what ways would you say we could rectify the difficulties there?
Well, I think, yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I think in a way, uh, some of those trends in the academic world, and I'm not talking about the natural sciences, I'm not talking about other fields. I'm talking really about the humanities here, particularly literature, and to some extent, well, not history so much, because historians are pretty down to earth people, and as down to earth people, historians recognize the role of religion in history. So you're not going to fool them. Although, the more unless you get some very ideological ones. I mean, you had Marxist historians in the West making great careers, but they, yeah, they don't have a monopoly of history. And you do have a variety of views. In literary studies, and the humanities, yeah, that's more of a problem. I'm not sure what one can do. I think to some extent these trends are self-destructive, and we can just sort of let them destroy themselves because they end up in a kind of absurdity. I mean, a lot of literary scholarship has become so divorced from reality that, and so politicized that it ceases to be what it was meant to be in the first place. And suddenly the study of literature becomes the study of politics, and it's not literature anymore. And I think it'll self-destruct. I mean, I hope it will, but I think it's headed that way because it's simply so misconceived. There is a lot of politicization in large parts of academia, and again, I think that's going to be self-destructive. People will simply lose interest and ignore it. And in fact, I suspect that a lot of the really creative thinking in fields like poetry is going to be outside the academic world. People just working on their own. Like a lot of echo chambers, it's just going to cave in on itself, and people will just ignore it. Um, in the best of cases, I think, but I think that's inevitable because I think anything that's really conceptually misconceived, philosophically self-contradictory, like a lot of the ideologies you get now, the ideologies in the humanities, they're going to self-destruct.
Right.
There's no other way. And maybe there'll be some kind of rebirth of a more sane and sober approach to literature and to the arts. Oh, let's hope so.
Yeah, I really hope so.
Mm.
Um, do you think that there is a role that the arts can play in changing a nation's attitude toward Christianity, or is the role of the
Yeah.
arts there kind of exaggerated?
No, I think it's very important. I do think that people of faith need to get into the arts, um, and I think that that is a very natural kind of vehicle for a lot of the thinking that they do because a lot of it is intuitive. I mean, you've got sort of the theologians doing logical theology, and that's great, and that has its place and it's important. But you have the poets doing a kind of intuitive exploration of faith. And I think that is going to reach a lot more people. There are only so many, I've had a lot of conversations with people of all sorts of belief systems, Marxists and people, materialists and former Christians and whatnot. And I mean, all sorts of people, logical argumentation doesn't always cut it. It doesn't always cut it in the public forum, though I usually try to use that. But some people just kind of ignore that, I find. And I think you can reach a lot of people in a kind of intuitive way through the arts, through poetry. There's too little interest in poetry, of course, in our country, and that's an unfortunate thing. I love places like France, which are so literary. A lot of that literature may be kind of misconceived, but boy, those people read, and then you've got a bookstore in every corner, and at least it used to be. I don't know what it is now, but there are cultures where literature is valued much more, and I wish it were valued more here. But given that, I think you can reach a lot of people through poetry, for example, and I think that. There is an aspect of religion and spirituality which is best expressed through kind of supralogical means, through the kind of poetry that it sort of leaps above logic. It goes beyond logic. And I think there's an important role for that. Music does that too. Painting does that too. And I think, incidentally, that the correspondences between poetry, music, and painting are certainly very interesting, very worth exploring. And particularly in the sort of spiritual key. But I also think that there's a lot that certainly Christian poets and other writers can do, and by getting into the mainstream. And this is another, thing I wanted to say. Actually, it's very important that you create a kind of milieu, as does your journal, to bring these people together and kind of for mutual reinforcement and mutual kind of cross-fertilization of ideas. At the same time, it's important to get out into the mainstream also. You have to do both. It's not an either or proposition. And there's some very there have been some cases of some very good Christian poets attaining national fame. Dana Gioia, I think, is one. So you need to do both. You need to have that mutual reinforcement and create that milieu with the cross-fertilization of ideas within the kind of Christian poetic milieu. And at the same time, you need to get out into that mainstream. And I think the difficulty there is that, of course, there's a kind of language which people of faith speak, which is a kind of closed code system. And that's all very well, but you also have to be able to speak to the broader society. And that's a difficult challenge. I mean, I really don't know what the answer there is. But I think that certainly poets of faith need to get out into that mainstream also, venture out there and find an audience, find an echo. It can be done. It has been done in the past. And I think of, even the case of someone like Boris Pasternak, great poet. I mean, he's well known for Dr. Zhivago as a prose writer, but there he was in the 30s, unable to do anything but translate, literature into Russian because, this is Stalinism, high Stalinism, and yet he writes these marvelous poems, very, very Christian poems, and eventually they get out, So in that kind of milieu, if he could survive as a poet, I think, certainly we can. But I think that yes, you need to do both. You need to have your milieu, and you also have to venture out and sort of fertilize that rather barren poetic world that we find, cultural world that we find ourselves in today. And I think that can succeed, that you can flower in the desert.
Yeah. I mean, I think that academia certainly has had cultural effect, the secularization of it over the last 100 or so years. But I think that we've seen a lot more rapid success in secularization of culture with movies.
Yes.
It seems that that's more the primary vehicle to me of all this. So I think that the arts, and especially with film, they do have a profound effect on cultural thinking. And that's why we need to reserve our seat at the table, so to speak. And I think
there's, and just to make it clear, I think it's important to have your milieu and some sort of cross-fertilization of ideas among people, of faith, and yet at the same time, you need to fertilize that culture around you without being corrupted by it or discouraged by it. You need to do both, but I think it's doable. Yes.
Yeah, it's extremely hard. It is extremely hard to walk the line of making art that is not necessarily it doesn't proselytize. While remaining true to your convictions.
And the tricky thing is with language, because people in the sort of Christian milieu speak a kind of coded language which they understand, but which outsiders don't always get. If you just come out with that, first of all, people are going to look at you and say, "Oh, more Christian stuff, forget it." Some editors will say that. I mean, I know. And second of all, people just won't understand it. So, but on the other hand, if you want to speak a language which is understandable by the average person today, it's a pretty impoverished kind of language. And if you start using all those rich allegories of the Christian tradition, they're just not going to get it. So that's a real challenge. That's a difficult, to sort of speak in a language which the broader public, de-Christianized, quickly, rapidly de-Christianizing public is going to understand, even though they don't get the references anymore. They may not understand the word. So you have to speak a language they can understand, but you have to speak a language which expresses well what you're trying to say. Very, very difficult challenge.
Right.
But challenge is what so.
Right. Yeah. It's right. Yeah. A different Andrew Reichard on one of the previous podcasts has said part of the task of being an artist is inherently oppositional to culture, which I think is pretty profound and accurate. And speaking of the cultural version to like Christian allegories, I think you're spot on, because most of my prose that I wrote back in my undergrad, um, it was acknowledged as good writing by my teacher, my creative writing teacher, but the form of the allegory, she just hated. She just hated allegory and parable and just all that. And it's like, well, that's very unfortunate, because I mean, you're not only closing yourself off to Christian forms. I mean, you're closing yourself off to all the other allegories of world literature, like Aesop's fables and stuff.
That's crazy.
Yeah. What advice would you give to young Christian artists and missionaries and activists who are trying to make a difference right now?
Write as well as you can, read as well as you can, read as much as you can. Have friends and try to find people, I mean, I don't want to say like-minded because that implies some kind of conformity, but people who are on your wavelength. Have at least a few of those, just for solidarity. But go out into the world and do not be afraid to confront that world, and you'll be surprised what echoes you'll find when you do that. Don't get too hermetic. You don't want to create a closed cult. This is a danger always, to become some kind of cult. You have to go out and encounter that world. But I think when you do that, you may be surprised how much of an echo and how much of a response you'll get. Because if you're speaking the truth, I mean, someone's going to hear that sooner or later and recognize it for the truth. Don't be discouraged.
Great. Well, Andrew, why don't you close us out by reading some of your poems?
Okay. Let's see. What do I have here? Oh, yes. Okay, here's one from Image called Curriculum Vitae. The lives of others have a point and aim. Each stage prepares them for the one to come. They know the rules and how to play the game. Their calculations yield a tidy sum. My opportunities were premature or late. My deepest love went undeclared. I hesitated when I could be sure. I should have been more cautious when I dared. And so our talents, dormant, pregnant, wait. Our wisdom deepens and accumulates until the day when finally we stare death in the face. Was all this heaven's share and not our own? For this alone makes sense. The heretofore is nothing to the hence. Okay, here's another one. This is one of the ones from Solum, if that's okay. This is the one, Christmas. Those childhood Christmases weren't drawn from stencils. No family prayers or carols. We don't sing. but love in every message scrawled in pencil, on every card and present tied with string. They have long passed into eternity. There are no children, only you and me. No blithe accord of credulous minds and hearts, nor hope to be rejoined in heaven's parts. I'll fashion a nativity within, an ardent creche against the dark and cold, and faithless chasm swallowing kith and kin. A lonely enterprise for one so old. If no one seeks it, does the light still shine? Not fate, but man insists on being blind.
Mm. That was excellent. Yeah, I really love the line, "I'll fashion a nativity within." I shared that with my friend, and he was like, "You got to publish that right now." So
Thank you. Thanks, your Brandon.
yeah. Well, Andrew, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. You've had very important things to say, and um, I know people value what you say. So, thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, thank you for listening. Bye bye.